My name's Stuart Bryan. If you're joining us online, thanks for doing so. Just wanted to read this real quick. It's out of 1 Corinthians. And it says, "And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." Pastor Jeff has been speaking on love since the beginning of the year, and our theme is Live Jesus Love. But today I'm going to preach on one of the ones that remains but is yet not the greatest. So we're going to talk about faith today. So that was, by the way, 1 Corinthians 13:13, if you wanted to know what that is. So the title of my message this morning is called Walking by Faith with That Sinking Feeling. And we're just going to be taking a look at Peter on the water. It's a nice day. It'd be a nice day to be on the water. So Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33 states, "Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat." Let me try if I can move this up a little bit. This will be less echo. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Am I echoing really bad? It sounds like I am. Go ahead. If not, I'll go to the handheld in just a second.
You know what? You're doing awesome. Let's get this right in.
I'm a lot of things in life, but a microphone technician is not one of them.
All right. Let's try and get that. That's why the pastor does this in the back before he even comes out into the congregation.
I didn't do a sound check.
Just a mental note.
All right.
Knock it out.
Still pretty echoey? Yeah? All right. It says, "Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake, and when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost!' they said. They cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid.' 'Lord, if it's you,' Peter replied, 'tell me to come to you on the water.' 'Come,' he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. 'You of little faith,' he said, 'why did you doubt?' And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" Everyone likes to pick on Peter. He's impulsive, he's brash, he's weak. He chops a man's ear off, and yet, fast forward a few hours, he's denying Christ. He steps out on the water, yet he sinks and he needs to be rescued. He even got into a tiff with the Apostle Paul. But see, personally, I like Peter because if you think about it, his narrative is the only one of the disciples that's really developed. He's the most detailed of your disciples. So let's take a look at Peter. Peter, in Matthew 4:18 to 22, is called from his vocation. Now, if I was on a boat, I'd be called from my vacation. But for Peter, it was his livelihood. And the thing is that in Matthew 4:18 to 22, Jesus calls Peter and Andrew from their boat. But see, it's not a dory, it's not a dinghy. It's a working vessel. It's their livelihood. This is a big thing for them. Now, Peter appears to be an established man. Other disciples, if you take a look at where they are in life, it's possible that they were actually teenagers. you know, young, older teenagers, but teenagers nonetheless. But Peter is an established man. He has a business, i.e. he's a fisherman and he's got his own boat. Okay? He's got a wife. He's got a house of his own. I'm assuming that his father-in-law has died because his mother-in-law lives with him and his wife. And Peter leaves this situation. He leaves this business. And he would have provided for his family with his fishing business. You know, he wasn't a Sunday caster. He was there, nets out working the sea. That was what he did. Can you imagine the conversation that occurs at the house? Honey, putting the business on a little bit of a sabbatical, met this wandering Jew, think he's a rabbi, gonna hang with him for a little while. Me and Andrew. Yeah, no, he's not gonna stay back and work on the boat. We're just gonna shut the whole thing down. That's cool, right? Probably not. I mean, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. The Bible leaves some details out. Leaves a lot of details out, actually. But you can save that question for heaven when you talk to Peter. But we also know that Peter was not a man of formal education. He didn't go to the schools to become a Pharisee or a Sadducee. He would have had whatever the basic education was at that time. But Peter would later go on to write part of the Bible and, in fact, be the de facto leader of the early church. And Peter had a boldness about him. It may have been a foolhardy boldness, and I think many of us can probably be accused of being bold without any kind of facts to back up the boldness at times. But he claimed that he'd stand with Jesus to the end. It's a pretty bold statement, because you know what he didn't know? He didn't know what the end was. He didn't like get the crib notes and say, oh, this is how this is going to go down. He wasn't an actor in a play, so he didn't know the final act. Instead, it was being written as he was living it. And he says, yep, I'm with you to the end. Through thick and thin. I'm your man. I'll be there. But Peter had a lot to lose. He had a business. He had a family. He had responsibilities. And I know we give him a hard time, but he had a lot to lose. But he makes his claim he's going to stand with Jesus to the end, and then less than 24 hours later, he's denying that he even knows Jesus. And then he went so far as to curse. He even cursed. His bold statement, it quickly evaporated when it came under scrutiny. Unfortunately, there was a real threat of arrest. Plus, he had already chopped the guy's ear off, so, he's a potential violent offender. And his bravado withered when his safety was in doubt. So let's just get some backdrop on this. In Matthew chapter 13, John the Baptist is beheaded, and Jesus seeks to find a place to be alone and mourn. Unfortunately for him, the people found out where he was headed and they met him there. Now, this is only unfortunate for Jesus. For everybody else, it was a really good thing. Because Jesus performs one of his most amazing miracles in chapter 14 when he feeds with the 5,000 plus in one sitting. And if you've ever organized a dinner, the feeding of like the 15, no 1,000, sometimes can be a big ordeal. And Jesus knocked out 5,000 plus. And when this finishes, he sends the disciples ahead on the boat. He sends them on ahead. Because why had he gone there? He went there to mourn. And you know what? He still needed that time alone. So he sends the disciples on ahead because he still has something he needs to do. And if you think about it, this was not just his family member, but it was his brother in ministry. And, he met with an unjust, violent end. And Jesus, frankly, he deserved the time and space to mourn. He was human just as we are. And this sets up our passage. The disciples have gone on ahead in a boat. It's most likely Peter's, since the other disciples, we don't know if they own one or not, but we know Peter definitely does. So now Peter's fishing business is water taxi. And he goes, Jesus stays behind and is alone and is mourning and communing with God. And so the disciples are in the boat, and Peter sees someone walking on the water. Now Peter, he might have been at the helm. If not, maybe it was Andrew. I have a rule about my cars and my motorcycles. You might be able to drive my car, but you'll never ride my motorcycle. Just saying. The list of people who are allowed to do so is empty. And I don't know what the rules on boats are, but it might have been a short list of who was allowed to man the tiller. But the fact of the matter is that Peter was probably somewhere in the boat paying attention, especially since he was the one who did the spotting of Jesus. So he's got to look out. And the thing is that he's on the lake at night, okay? And when you're on the lake at night, you need to be very aware of your surroundings, because sky and sea sometimes look the same. Shore might have lights on it, which can throw you off. So you have to really be alert. You got to keep your eyes out for other boats. Not only that, but the lighting they had back then was left something to be desired. It involved fire, on a wooden boat. So they would have not had a roaring fire. They would have had some sort of enclosed light. So Peter's on the lookout. It's nearing dawn. And if you've ever driven or ridden or walked at dawn, when it's kind of half dark, half light, it's kind of a weird time. It's my least favorite time to drive, actually, because it seems like night lasts forever. And then suddenly, bang, it's morning. But it's that weird little period right there. Nearing dawn. And so disciples are keeping their eyes out for the other boats. But can you imagine their surprise and even fear at seeing a man walking on the water? I mean, I don't know. Usually when you see something you're not expecting, it doesn't even have to be scary. It just surprises you. And then if it's something that doesn't seem to actually match what's physically possible, it's even more scary or hard to comprehend. People get into accidents because they're looking for one thing and they see something else. And they say, I never saw it. But if they're looking for boats and they see a guy. And so the disciples cry out, it's a ghost. Well, given the options, it was either a ghost or potentially a dolphin doing like a tail dance across the sea. And so they opted for ghost. I don't know how many dolphins are on the Sea of Galilee. Probably like none. If they had dolphins there, they would already be like a theme park wrapped around us in today's day and age. But Jesus responds, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. And this next part is my favorite. But let's back up for a second first. Let's go back and read the first part of our text today. It says, later that night he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Now this is just a guess, okay? All right? But Peter, Andrew, one of them's at the helm. It's pretty choppy out there. Now we're back to my favorite part. Peter cries out to Jesus. Now, he probably cried out to Jesus, frankly, because the wind was howling. But the waves are slapping the boat, and he cries out, Lord, if it's you. And I'm not going to cry out, because I can't pull this down like Chris does. So, Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. See, Peter wants to follow Jesus. How many people do you know who, when faced with a choppy sea, want to get out of the boat that's offering safety? Not too many. Not too many go, this is safe, we're at a dangerous spot, let's go where it's worse. You maybe check their temperature, or you talk about them, well, sorry, it's our crazy uncle. He was dropped a lot on his head as a kid. But Peter demonstrates something here that hasn't even been written yet. 2 Corinthians 5:7. For we walk by faith, not by sight. See, Peter was willing to go, but he wanted to be commanded to do so. See, he knew that things happened when Jesus spoke. Now, if you fast forward, or go backwards rather, just a few hours, he'd been told to pass out loaves and fish, and they fed 5,000. So Peter's no dummy. Very little food, many, many mouths. It just keeps coming. But Jesus commanded them to hand out the bread and the loaf and the fish. And based upon that, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that there was power in the words of the Lord. But let's just think about our senses for a minute. See, our senses have developed to gather external physical input, which is data, and then our brains process it. Now, we have no senses for the spiritual except what the Holy Spirit gives and our spirit discerns. But there's not like, there may have been a movie called The Sixth Sense, but there actually isn't a sixth sense. Okay? However, as believers, we can train that spiritual sense through time spent with God, His Word, and in service to Him. The problem is that it's not natural. It's not a natural sense. If I want to train, so I shortened a finger. Don't do it. It's a bad deal. But part of the thing I had to do is when I shortened this finger, accidentally, but I had to desensitize my finger because suddenly the end of my finger wasn't here, it was here. And so these nerves, which had never been touched directly, suddenly were now at the very business end of action. And so I had to desensitize it by like banging it on things and doing other things that would make you feel awful. But the fact of the matter is that even doing that, I was training the sense of touch in my finger. And what was amazing to me is the fact that I can now do that without like feeling like I'm going to retch. Because God made our bodies in a wonderful and amazing way. But the fact is that the nerves were able to be retrained. Think about it. Babies. It is not natural to walk. I mean, if you think about it, it's probably natural just to lay flat. You know, gravity. Just think about it. It takes effort to stand. If I fall asleep, do I stand on my feet? No, I go to my natural position. Right? But we train senses. We take the data from them, but we also exercise them. So we need to train the spiritual sense. And the challenge is that spiritual sense sometimes, maybe even often, can run contrary to the natural and the natural law of things. And that's where we get this battle in our brain. Because, you know, this happens less, but when I was younger, my brain would tell me to do things that, like, you know, my brain was writing checks that my body couldn't cash. It's like, you know, can we do it? I was always the guy that said, yes, we can. You know? I've never tried flight, just like this, but besides that, I tried almost everything else. My mom and dad are in the front row, and there's a reason that my mother, when I was growing up, had had some training as a trauma nurse. Is because I would show up covered in blood and sometimes with parts of me at weird angles and all sorts of different things, you know? But the fact is that natural law is not called natural suggestion. It is called natural law for a reason. And so Peter, being a reasonably smart man, he knew the water wasn't solid. I mean, I'm guessing he's probably never seen it. This is Israel. It's kind of warm there. I don't know if they'd actually had snowfall. I know they'd seen snowfall, but maybe Peter had never physically seen it because he hadn't been up to the mountains. But the fact of the matter is, he knew that water wasn't a solid. And because it wasn't a solid, he knew he couldn't walk on it. And being a fisherman, he may have even known people who'd lost their lives on the Sea of Galilee, or maybe had a little bit too much to drink as they were out on the boat and suddenly decided they were going to walk home because it wasn't safe to sail. But the fact of the matter is that he knew these things. This is what he knew. These are facts, undeniable facts. And so the problem is this isn't a confidence booster. But in verse 29, come, Jesus says. And so then Peter got down out of the boat, he walked in the water and came toward Jesus. Peter set that aside, though. He set aside that knowledge of water not being a solid, people he knew who drowned, natural law, and he stepped out onto a liquid in motion. I no longer call you servants, it says in John 15:15, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I've called you friends. For everything I have learned, that I have learned from my Father, I have made known to you. Galatians 4:7. So you are no longer a slave, but God's child, and since you are his child, God has also made you, has made you also an heir. See, we aren't called to be servants. We aren't called to be servants or slaves, but instead we're called to be friends, fellow heirs, and God's children. Now, we choose to serve. But our status in God's family is that of heir and joint heir. It's family member, adopted child. John Wesley once stated, before we can possibly walk by faith, we must learn to live by faith and not by sight. See, Peter had been living with Jesus day in and day out. And while his faith hadn't been made perfect, we have to assume it was pretty strong. Peter steps out in the water. Now, that first step probably was fairly terrifying. Because if you think about it, never been off this step before, no idea how far away it is, can't see where I'm going. Have you ever done this in the dark? Not having a clue how close that step is? I know it would have been terrifying for me. A few years ago, I went onto one of those treetop adventure parks. We had an Italian exchange student living with us for a little while, and my wife was trying to come up with things that we could do around here. And so at the very end of our time, we went on a course that frankly was pretty scary and not just a little difficult. It was a lot difficult. And for somebody who's an experienced adventure park tree climbing person, it was probably like, yeah, walk in the park. But for me, it was like walking the park of terror. And the last thing that we had to do was to hook a friction reel to our harness and then just jump or step off of this platform that was like 40 feet in the air. I'll be frank with you, it was unnatural and extremely difficult for me to do. And I have to tell you, I was the biggest cheerleader for all the teens who were in front of me to just do it. Come on, be brave. You can do it. No one's died yet. They didn't have this place shut down by now. So last person to go was me. I knew all the teens in front of me had survived, which was really fortunate because we didn't want to have a conversation with Italian parents. I don't speak much Italian, you know. I'm not sure how you apologize. But it scared me. And the worst part was, it was the end of the day, I was exhausted. I know I might look like I'm a great physical specimen, but I'm not really that in shape, and I wasn't then either. And so I knew it was the only way down, so I basically just stepped off the platform and then landed / stumbled safely to the ground when I got there. But see, Peter was a considerable distance from land on the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Sea of Galilee is 8 miles across and 141 feet deep today. I don't know how big it was then. No one drew maps that survive. What they did draw were not that accurate. But the fact of the matter is that 8 miles across and 141 feet deep, that's decent. I mean, it wasn't called like the Pond of Galilee. It was called the Sea of Galilee. And so this puts my tree climbing experience to shame. He stepped out on rough seas and began to walk to Jesus. Peter literally put his faith in action. He gave it legs, as it were. He does a couple important things here. Number one, he acts on his faith in accordance with God's will, which, if you remember, he verified. Are we so careful to ensure that it's God's will before we step out in faith, as Peter did here? Do we ask him to call us there, or do we simply go and hope the angels catch up? Number 2, Peter kept his eyes fixed on Jesus while doing the task. See, he established God's will by asking Jesus to tell him to do something. It's a very interesting way to phrase it. He didn't say, ask me to come, as in make a suggestion. Like, well, if you want. It's like, what do you want for dinner? I don't know. Where do you want to go? I don't know. It's not helpful. So far, I'm not sure if you want dinner, if we're going to eat dinner, if we're going anywhere for dinner. You know, I'm sure we've all had those kind of conversations. I may have had one in the last 24 hours. I may have actually given the same response. We may have gotten pizza as a result of that. But, because just so you know, if it ends in pie, it's typically a decent restaurant experience. So, and I may have come home with a raspberry tart, which is kind of like a pie, with pizza, which is also a pie. But the fact is that he asked him to tell him to do something. Now, when Jesus tells you to do something, there's weight to it, because it wasn't a Jesus suggestion. Jesus didn't say, well, come if you want to. Come if you feel like it. Come if you're wearing floating shoes. He just said, come. See, if Jesus didn't want it to happen, we know that Jesus had no problem speaking his mind and being straight with Peter. He'd already established that he had no problem being straight with Peter in earlier chapters. But see, the thing is that Peter trusted in Jesus, not in natural law. He believed in natural law, but he trusted in Jesus. See, we often struggle to believe in the impossible, like healing, but Peter just needed Jesus' agreement and instruction to go for it. Because see, Jesus supersedes natural law. He made it. He doesn't even operate on the same plane. John 14:8-14 shows that the disciples still lacked faith, even after witnessing such a miracle as feeding a great multitude. Verse 8, Philip says, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. Really? I'm surprised he just didn't say, really? But instead he answers, don't you know me, Philip? Even after I've been among you for such a long time? Anyone who's seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but rather it is the Father living in me who is doing the work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. Or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works that I've been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father. And I will do whatever you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You see that? I will do whatever you ask in my name, so the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you're not sure why Jesus is around, it's to bring glory to God. That's why he's around. Jesus is like the glory of the Father. You may ask for me for anything in my name. Ask me in my name, and I will do it. Peter said, tell me to come. Ask me to go. In other words, by the way, if Jesus tells you to do something, it's in his name. Like, he can't say, in my name, do this. He's already saying it. It's in his name. The bottom line here, though, is that we don't ask, so we don't get. We lack faith, so we don't ask. Back to our story, Peter's senses would have been screaming, danger, Will Robinson. Because the moment he swung his feet over the side and stepped onto the sea, it would have just been very challenging mentally. But the thing is, he kept one of his senses locked on the Master. 4 of them were going nuts. 1 of them was fixed on Jesus. And this singleness of mind and purpose helped him to be one of only 2 humans in the history of the world to check off sea stroll on their bucket list. I've taught orienteering and navigating in the woods before, and one of the principles is fixed points. I've forgotten almost everything I already knew, though, so don't ask me to help us if we get lost. But here's what I do know. Set your eyes on the fixed point after you determine that it's in the right direction. And then you keep that fixed point in the center of your view, and then you walk towards it until you arrive at that. And then based upon your orientation, this is going to sound really technical, but based upon your orientation to the fixed point, you do one of these things. You pick another fixed point, you check it, okay, it's straight. I'm going to the next fixed point. And you do the same thing. And that's how you don't walk in circles. So if you ever get lost in the mall or a parking lot, now you have no excuse. So Peter walked close enough to Jesus that Jesus was within reach when Peter started to sink. So let's think about this for a second. When Jesus said, come, because Jesus, what was Jesus doing when Jesus said, come? Walking on the water, right? So what do you think Jesus was doing after Jesus said, come? God bless you. He was walking on the water. I mean, he wasn't just like, all right, I mean, maybe he did this, you know, like the puppy thing or your kid when they just start to walk. Come on. I doubt that happened. You know what I'm saying? Like, that would have been so unmanly, you know? I mean, I'm not even sure how small and cute Peter was. But the fact of the matter is Jesus probably just kept doing what he was doing, which was just walking. And so Jesus kept walking towards the boat, but Peter was by the boat, so Jesus kept walking towards Peter. See, God tells us that if we draw near to him, he'll draw near to us. And nowhere else in Scripture is this so clearly demonstrated as the example of Peter walking towards Jesus on the water. See, the thing is it requires ownership of our faith walk, right? We must be actively engaged. We can't just do a, oh, help me prayer that doesn't result in action. Okay? This is an active thing. It's an engaged thing. If Peter had just said, okay, and just stood there, he would have been standing on the water. But instead, he needed to walk towards Jesus. And when he walked towards Jesus and Jesus walked towards him, it took half as long to cover the distance. Isn't that neat? You know, it's like the math problem. If you've got a train that leaves, Duluth, Minnesota, or wherever it is called, and heads towards you at 3,000 miles an hour and it's covering the stretch distance, and you're like, ah. But it is. It's 2 things coming towards each other at speed, and it takes less time. The other thing about this is that faith requires testing. In James 1:3, Jesus' brother James writes about the testing of our faith producing patience. Therefore, our faith needs to and will be tested. Jesus rescued Peter when he started to sink. He didn't let Peter drown in his situation. Instead, Jesus gave Peter a ready way of escape. And lastly, Peter gave up too soon. And Jesus chided him for that. And did Jesus wait when Peter started to sink? No. First word in verse 31 says immediately. Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. Then he chides him and says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? It's easy to be a starter. It's so hard to be a finisher. My biggest struggle in life is finishing things. My wife can attest to that. We live in a construction project. Many, many projects. So few finished. None finished, really. But the fact is that it's the going the distance. It's the last part where you finish it up. See, the thing is starting is glorious. You feel it, right? You're like, oh, I'm starting something new. It's amazing. It's exciting. And then you get into like the boring stuff. The dotting of the I's, the crossing of the T's, the spell checks, the punctuation, the drudgery of it. And then the last part is like the cleanup. You got to finish it. You got to make sure everything's done and it's finished and tidy, and the painting and the sanding and the whatever else you're doing for the project, putting the wheels back on the car, whatever it is, tightening the lug nuts. It's the last part, and you're like, ugh. But the thing is that in John 17:4, Jesus spoke about the fact that finishing the tasks God has for us brings God glory. See, God's glory is in the seeing things that God has asked us to do through to completion. That's the glory. It's the finishing of the race. It's not the beginning of the race. It's not the middle of the race. There can be glory there, but God's glory is in the completing of the task. And see, there's a lot to be learned with what we have here with Peter. God will never leave us, nor will he forsake us, as it says in Deuteronomy 31:6, and again in Hebrews 13:5. And I love the fact it's repeated, just to remind us. Once in the Old Testament, if you're an Old Testament person, once in the New, just in case you're a New Testament person. But remember, he'll never leave us nor forsake us, and he won't let us drown. And James states, again, that we will face trials. But if we make it through the testing of our faith, we'll gain perseverance, patience, and become mature and complete, lacking nothing. We must persevere during the trials in order to gain from them. If we don't, it is simply needless suffering and a waste of time and effort. And that is not God's way. Needless suffering is called torture. And God is not out to torture us. God tells us he wants all things to work together for our good. But we must be careful to not try and short-circuit that by looking for an easy out, or a fast finish, or a better way, or a give up right at the end. Remember, the glory is in seeing things through to completion. Peter had a boldness and a willingness to trust the Master, and we need to have the same thing. Being the children of God, we need that childlike faith to believe in the impossible. Because, see, children, they learn natural law many times the hard way. Like, they actively test it. Gravity, heat. Right? Because what they're doing is they're exploring the limits of their world and their body. And that's why kids are so fast to believe things. You know, if you lie to a kid and you tell them you can do like superhero type stuff, they'll believe you until you prove them wrong. I mean, obviously that's lying and that's bad, so don't do that. But the fact is that they're going to trust you unless they've already experienced the fact that it's not possible. That's when their world gets a little bit smaller. That's why they have such crazy thoughts and dreams, and you're like, this kid is mad. But they're not mad. They just don't know the boundaries yet. But we need that childlike faith to believe in the impossible and trust that God will see us through the good times, through the bad. When the storms of life come, there may be unique opportunities in the midst of that storm to step out in faith and get radical, to grow exponentially in our faith and let God stretch us, because that could have just been another storm on the Sea of Galilee. And we don't know that Jesus was actually walking towards the boat to get on the boat. He could have just been doing the shortest walk between 2 points, because he'd sent them out on the boat to go to the other side. And maybe he just didn't feel like walking around the outside of the sea and just said, well, I mean, I'm not bound by natural law, so let's go. You know, as the crow flies or as Jesus walks. He just did it. So we don't know if he was headed to the boat to go hang out with them. But the fact of the matter is that instead of that being a wasted opportunity, It was an opportunity for Peter to grow in his faith, and yet the others who witnessed it, the disciples, their faith was impacted as well. And you heard that declaration, truly you are the Son of God. So, if we can make it through the storms in our life victoriously, this testing of our faith successfully, the storm that raged in the darkness will cease, and dawn will break on calm seas and smooth sailing. Now I'm going to ask you that if you are going through a test of your faith right now, that when I close this, that you come up front for prayer. But here's the thing. I'm going to ask that you take active ownership in your trial. And that you don't just come up for prayer. Anytime someone comes up to me for prayer, I always make them pray for themselves first. Because I want them to actually take ownership of their request. Because if you just keep coming up and asking different people to pray for you, I have no magical connection to God, no superpower, no, my prayers are just as good as anybody else's. So coming up front to ask somebody to pray for you, that's good. But praying for yourself, that's better. Because the Bible tells us to make our requests made known to God. It doesn't say make their requests made known to God. It says make our requests made known to God. So let me pray. And then if you want to come up and pray for yourself and be prayed for, if you're going through any kind of a test of your faith, come up front. Don't delay. And I'm going to pray a prayer of dismissal. All right? Father God, I thank you for who you are. I thank you that your word is so awesome. And that it's just full of just so much that we can learn from, Father God. And I thank you that you are willing to meet us in our time of testing. And that you're not distant, but that you are with us. And that if we walk towards you, you are already walking towards us. You're ready. You're there. And you're just waiting for us to come and get oriented to the right direction and head to you. And so I ask you, Father God, that if anyone here is going through a time of testing, whether it's a trial of health, a trial of finances, a trial of life situations and difficult relationships, jobs challenges, whatever it happens to be, whatever kind of challenge to our faith, even just doubting our faith in you. And I ask you, Father God, that they be bold enough to come forward for prayer and they be willing to pray for themselves and to have ownership and take ownership and take action on this trial in their life and to step out in faith and allow you to build it and allow you to make the impossible possible in accordance with your will. I ask you, Father God, to bless Pastor Jeff, who's down ministering. To bless any of those who are not with us today and be with them. And I ask you, Father God, that as we leave, that you bless our days, help us to come back together on Sunday with great testimonies to tell of your faithfulness and all you've done for us, Father God, and for us to be bold. We're outside these walls, just as bold about you as we are when we're in them. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Come.